For Morningstar, I'm Jeremy Glazer. Now that the Senate has passed their version of the tax bill, we have a clearer picture. We're starting to get a clearer picture of what the final legislation may look like. Here today with Aron Szapiro. He's our Director of Policy Research for his take. Aron, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with the Senate bill, and then we can look at some of the differences with the House version and what you think is going to happen there. Big picture, anything surprising change in the Senate bill from when we discussed it last until when it was passed early on Saturday?
Not really. There was just some tweaking around the edges. I guess the biggest surprise is probably a change to 529 accounts. A lot of our viewers are probably familiar with those. That would allow you to use that money to pay for K through 12 education. That really is a substantial change in the tax treatment of 529s and a pretty big change in sort of how we've subsidized people or paid for public and private education.
One of the things we had talked about before was the potential for this bill to change capital gains or maybe increase capital gains payouts because of the way that the tax laws would work. But there was some clarification on that would not apply directly to mutual funds themselves.
Right. They wouldn't apply to the mutual funds themselves. And that's clarification that came out of the Senate Finance Committee staff. But it would apply to investors in those mutual funds, if that makes any sense. And so the idea is that investors wouldn't be able to use alternative ways of calculating their capital gains and losses, but rather they'd have to use first in, first out. This is really seems to me to be kind of aimed at the expansion or democratization of tax loss harvesting strategies. And I think it's important to remind people that these were always strategies for tax deferral, not really tax avoidance permanently. And so I'm not sure how strong an impact they'll really have. But in any case, that provision is still in the Senate bill is not in the House bill.
Let's take a look at the differences then as the bills head to conference to try to get one piece of legislation here. What are some of the biggest differences that are going to have to be hammered out?
Well, the biggest difference is the difference in the tax rates for individuals. So the House bill has 4 brackets as opposed to the 7 brackets in the Senate bill. Obviously, that needs to be reconciled. There are differences in the tax credit for families, for children, that needs to be changed as well. So those are 2 pretty big differences. And then I think the other really big difference, both the House and the Senate agree that there should be different tax rates for people who own pass-through businesses. These are businesses that are not organized as corporations, but rather pass through all of their profits to their owners, which had traditionally been taxed at individual tax rates. Both the House and Senate bill have breaks, but they're quite different from each other. The House has a very complicated kind of formula that phases in the break for certain kinds of businesses. And the Senate bill, after some negotiating, is just a 20% deduction applied to anybody who is paid through a pass-through business. Or I shouldn't say anybody. There are a lot of exceptions and exemptions. And frankly, it's going to take a while to figure out what it all means and who it applies to. And the accountants and lawyers will figure out how they can use the rules to the best of their clients' advantages.
Let's talk about the mortgage interest deduction. This has been a hot topic of conversation. Looking across the 2 bills, are there huge differences there, or do you think that the value of that mortgage interest deduction is going to be diminished?
So I'll continue to say that I actually don't think. I mean, there is a difference on paper, which is that in the House bill, only up to the first $500,000 of a mortgage, only that basis can apply for the mortgage interest deduction. The Senate retains the current cap, which is $1 million. The Senate does some other things, gets rid of a tax preference for home equity lines of credit. I actually don't think that this difference is all that big a deal because both bills double the standard deduction. They pay for it by getting rid of the personal exemption. And by doubling the standard deduction, they make it so most people will be unable to itemize. And if you can't itemize, you can't get the benefit of the mortgage interest deduction or the charitable deduction for that matter. That's actually something that tax wonks on both sides of the aisle have long thought, that this sort of subsidy for mortgage interest is kind of priced fully into the market and maybe isn't a great use of tax expenditure. But in any case, by doubling the standard deduction, it really equalizes the treatment of your taxes as a renter to your taxes as a buyer for many, many, many people. Not all people, but many people. And so I think that, that is a really significant change. And in fact, there's been quite a bit of focus on this $500,000 cap or $1 million cap, and that will matter to some people, but it won't matter to a lot of people who just won't itemize anymore because of that doubling of the standard deduction and because you won't be able to itemize your state and local income taxes. So, there's actually pretty broad agreement, and it seems very likely that will be in the final package, given that we see that language in both the House and the Senate bills.
Big picture, do you think that there's enough common ground here that they will be able to move quickly and get this done by the end of the year?
Yeah, it seems very likely. There's obviously a lot of pressure to get this done, to hand the president a legislative achievement. I think also, and this is not necessarily meant as a knock on the bill, but major reforms often make people nervous. They're often pretty unpopular. This bill does not poll very well, and so I think there's going to be a lot of pressure to sort of just get it done and kind of move on. The longer that they wait, the more easy it will be for opponents to mobilize against it. So I actually think it's moving very quickly. And no, none of this, again, because there's broad agreements on the corporate tax rate, broad agreements there should be some change through pass-through, broad agreements on limiting the number of people who can itemize on the personal income tax side. I think the other stuff, and they're big details, they need to get sorted out, but I think they probably will.
Aron, thanks for your take on this, and we'll be sure to keep talking to you as we get a better sense of what that final piece looks like.
Yeah, thanks so much.
For Morningstar, I'm Jeremy Glazer. Thanks for watching.